the best thing that you can do is consistency. If you do this 5 minutes a day, 10 minutes a day, it's exciting, it's challenging, it's different, and it really does help you.
Let's start at the top. Like, what is a neurophysiologist? Like, what are the kinds of things that you study and treat?
We'll start from the start about how I ended up here, and then we'll get into the neurophysiology.
Love it.
I was an elite triathlete. I raced for Australia, which is where I got my love and thirst for athleticism and also the brain. And at that time, I was studying exercise physiology and teaching. I then went on and did a master's, and that's where I learned about the brain. I was, when you go into these human biology, you see cadavers and you see brains, and I thought, well, this is incredible. I fell in love with the brain, and I decided, okay, this is what I want to do. But I didn't really want to go into the medical field and be a doctor per se. I didn't want to go in and be a surgeon. I wanted to just study the brain. And that led me into neurophysiology. So I went to Sydney Medical School, and neurophysiology is a subspecialty of neurology. So you'll go and see a neurophysiologist for something such as a neurodegenerative disease like MS, for example. Have you ever seen an EEG being performed? Somebody who has epilepsy or someone who's had a seizure, they may go and see a neurophysiologist and have an EEG, which is a cap with all these leads coming out of your head, and it assesses the brain waves or the functionality of your brain. That's one modality. Another thing is an EMG, one of those things where you put the little needles in and you're testing the nerve fibers. So they're the types of things that I do.
Wow, amazing.
Yeah.
And then you ended up, at least initially, working with athletes. Am I correct?
Yeah. So when I was a triathlete, when I retired, and that was that was about 10 years ago now, I started working with athletes because I wanted to really bridge the gap between neurology and high performance, because when I was an athlete, nobody was talking to me about the brain, about sleep, about nutrition. We were just taught to just go hard or go home. So I thought, imagine if I could start educating athletes on the brain and the nervous system. How much better would they perform on the field? So I started working with athletes, and I started primarily doing EEGs.
Wow.
Yeah, I was working with NFL, and which is a very controversial topic. I don't go near NFL players anymore, just due to the amount of head trauma that they go through. I didn't really like seeing it. But this EEG scan, it's a hospital-grade EEG that I use, and it spits out a 30-page report on the functionality of somebody's brain.
Wow, what does it tell you? What does an EEG tell you?
Oh my gosh. Well, this specific one, it does event-related potential. So we can test somebody's reaction time. We can test their full visual acuity. We can test many different things, how well their brain is functioning, where we can pick up on different areas of dysfunction. They may be having dysfunction in their frontal lobe, their parietal lobe. So when I talk about actual reaction time, we can say, okay, your reaction time for a stimulus was 0.8 or 1.5. Let's put you on a program and let's decrease that reaction time and get you functioning better. We can also see how well the optic nerve is functioning. Now, the optic nerve is the nerve that connects the eyeball to the brain. So we can see how fast the stimulus is traveling to the brain. So how fast it takes you to see a ball, realize it's a ball, go back to the brain, and then throw the ball. So we can decrease that as well.
That's amazing, because I feel like most of the time when it comes to augmenting athletic performance, coaches tend to be, at least from my vantage point, and I'm not an athlete, I've never been, but focused primarily on the body and the musculature and doing drills and things like that. Yeah. Which is so it's an interesting and I think fairly novel, again, at least from my vantage point, approach to focus on the brain.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I was seeing. So many people are working on the neck down. They're working on the skills of an athlete. They're working on the tactics. But when you see an elite athlete, let's take an NBA player. When they're at the NBA, they already know, they've got the fitness down pat. They know the tactics. They know the drills. There's not so much that you can teach them, and this is in my perspective, that they're not going to, they're going to say, oh, wow, I didn't know how to do this. However, if you look and get a seasoned athlete, let's just say they're 30, 35, we know that the brain starts to atrophy at the age of 30, not to mention the amount of sleep deprivation they go through, stress. A lot of my players, unfortunately, are smoking weed and drinking alcohol as well.
Wow.
Yeah, which is surprising. So you think there is nobody there teaching them about cognitive performance. So that's really what it was about. And so I always say that I work from the neck up, and I don't take over when it's the strength coaches. I have nothing to do with that.
So what does your approach entail? I would imagine that it's pretty holistic, pretty like all encompassing.
Yeah, well, so we will take an athlete on board and we'll do everything. We'll even look at lab panels. So we'll do bloods, we'll do DNA test, and then we'll also do an EEG scan. We'll test the functionality of their brain, and then we'll do a brain check and look at different cognitive biomarkers.
Biomarkers that are related to like neurodegeneration?
Well, some of them, yes, but also biomarkers that are related to their sport. Yeah. So we can do a memory test. We can do a cognitive test. We can do we've got different batteries of tests that we use. We've come up with over 25 different batteries of tests that test different areas of their performance, which is why we only really work with ball sports.
Yeah,
because if we were to go and work with every sport, it would be hard for us to really get that battery. So right now we're working solely with NBA, Major League Baseball, and tennis. Oh, and cricket now.
Well, when you talk about reaction time, that's something that obviously is super relevant to the world of athleticism, but it's also very relevant to just everyday life, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like avoiding car accidents, or for the gamers out there playing, being good at video games, or, catching something as it falls off the kitchen counter.
Yeah,
even.
Especially as you get older, the first thing and the biggest thing that goes as you age is focus. And then those focus regions is where attention lies as well. So it's only natural to want to keep training this as you get older.
So how do you train for these kinds of processes?
Well, that's through a number of different exercises. So we use, one that everyone can do is just get a tennis ball or get 2 tennis balls and start throwing it to the wall. And there's about 150,000 different drills that you can do with a tennis ball. And that tests not just reaction time, but hand-eye coordination, balance, and it does so many different things. That's the first basic thing that we'll start with all of our players in a warm-up. Then we'll move on. We've got lights. We've got number pattern drills. So we're working with word fluency. When I talk about word fluency, one thing that we're using is the letters F, S, and A. And we use those to get them to react and be able to process different words while they're doing a reaction training drill.
What do you mean? Explain that.
So, for example, we have a number pattern drill. When there's numbers everywhere all over the wall, and they may have to chronologically find 1 to 50 in a given time frame. Then maybe they're working on lights. Okay, so we have these lights set up where they have to react to them. And let's say that the red light comes up. When the red light comes up, that will say a word starting with the letter F. Then a green light comes up, say a word starting with the letter S. And right now it seems, okay, that seems quite easy. But when you're under the pump and you're under the pressure, you have to really think about it. It is an excruciating task to do.
Wow.
Yeah. And it's funny with the number drill, for some reason, most of my boys and all of my athletes are males, they get to the number 13 and for some reason they can't see the number 14. But when they stop, they take a breath and they step back, they can see the number 14. So it just shows you that when you are under pressure, like in a game, sometimes you can't see things, or sometimes you are so stressed that you can't figure out a word.
Now, do brain challenges like this, some would call them brain games, do they have any kind of enduring effect on our cognitive function?
Enduring as in how?
Well, do they make you better? I'm assuming they get better at those games. Do they have the effect of improving cognitive function when somebody is out and about in the world? Is there a spillover effect?
Yeah, there is, because we make it very relatable. And I'm talking, can we relate this to on the field or on the court? And yes, we can, because we mimic what would happen on game day or would mimic what would happen in a sport. However, we do know that you can relate anything, like whatever we're doing in our daily tasks, you don't realize the amount of things that your brain has to process during a day without you even knowing, unconsciously. Even just processing what I'm saying right now takes some kind of enduring load. So you can say that putting cognitive load like this and training the brain that way can show up in every day.
What about for regular folks that are listening to this? Like, what are some tools, commonly available tools that people might use to kind of emulate some of these challenges that you are able to provide your patients in the clinic?
Well, honestly, the very first thing that they can do is get a ball and just start throwing the ball to the wall and doing
Throwing and then catching it, or
yeah.
just
And I always say do an overhead ball, or do an overhead
overhand
yes,
throw?
overhand throw, and start with the right hand and just throw the ball, stand a meter away from the wall. Then swap hands, get your left hand and do that. And then throw the ball with the right hand, catch with the left hand. And then what you even want to do is, we know that the left part of the brain is responsible for the right side of the body, and the right side responsible for the left side of the body. Maybe you want to throw with the right hand, but just stand on your left leg.
Whoa.
Yeah, so then that gets a bit tricky. And then you may even want to come up with drills. Maybe if you've got a partner at home, throw the ball to each other, stand on one leg. And so there's just so many different things and variations that you can do. But the best thing that you can do is consistency. If you do this 5 minutes a day, 10 minutes a day, it's exciting, it's challenging, it's different, and it really does help you.
Does this build what is referred to as the cognitive reserve?
Yes, I love this. Cognitive reserve. If you think about it as a muscle, just think about your brain as a muscle. You have to train and you have to build up cognitive reserve. So if you start building this in your 20s, 30s, and 40s, you're going to have a better effect to be able to retain cognitive reserve in your 50s, 60s, and 70s.
I can already tell that I would be terrible at this, like the ball
Probably
thing.
It's not easy because it's very different. People are like, well, I haven't caught a ball since I was, a kid.
What about I've heard brushing your teeth with the opposite hand?
Okay, yes, and I've heard that, and it's okay. That's maybe a tiny bit of a challenge, but we can work a bit harder than that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
not
that's
challenging enough.
It's not challenging, and you really need to stress. Your brain needs to go through stress in order for it to adapt, just the same as your body. If you want to grow your bicep, you have to place it under stress. You have to do it consistently. And so this is the exact same for the brain.
It's interesting because we hear so often that stress is bad.
Yeah, we do. But that's, stress can be bad if it's chronic stress and if it's the bad stress. But stress placed upon a certain stimulus in a good way is a good thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What is chronic stress? I mean, just so that people can identify like the difference between the two types.
Yeah. So good stress would be when you go and you activate your sympathetic nervous system in a way that's getting your blood flowing. I always say that brain health is about vascular health. So let's just say we go to the gym and we're putting our body under some type of stress. That is stress, but we're not doing it chronically, maybe doing it for 20 minutes. And that's good. We're getting so many different effects from that type of stress. But when we're stressed and we're not sleeping and we've got mental stress and emotional stress, and that keeps building up, that is the bad stress. That is the stress that ends up turning into anxiety and chronic stress. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I guess like when you're in the gym and you're stressing out your muscles, that's like an hour-long event, right? But the kind of chronic protracted stress that lasts hours, days, weeks, months,
Yeah.
It's much different.
And when we hear stress, people think about cortisol, which is, this demon thing that happens when we stress. And yes, cortisol is good, evidently, and inflammation as well. It can be good. We need both, but it's if it's in abundance, if it's in too much, if we have too much cortisol, if we have too much inflammation, if we have too much stress, then that leads to damaging effects, both on the brain, the body, and our spiritual system.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You test for all that stuff, like in inflammatory biomarkers and the like?
Yeah, we do. We do baseline, like C-reactive protein. And that's a really good measure, but I don't think it's like a be all and end all.
Yeah.
It depends on, what you've done in the last.
Well, how do you manage like that for athletes who are under, I would assume that they're under chronic stress with the rigors of the training schedule that they're under and
remember, athletes train in seasons. So a lot of them are during, the off season, they get a really big break. And then when you look at the NBA season, the playoffs is when they're traveling to 2 or 3 cities a week. That's when they're chronically stressed. So that's when we really need to double down on their jet lag protocol. We need to double down on who they're talking to, what they're eating, how much they're hydrating, because that's when it really matters. And that's when they're just getting the most sleep deprived. And I hate it.
Wow. Talk about hydration, because I've heard you talk about hydration on other shows and the relevance of fluid intake, electrolytes, and the like for cognitive function.
So huge. So even just a mere 3% dehydration can drop your mental capacity.
Wow.
And I think the percentage that I quoted was around 20 to 30% decrease mental capacity and cognitive performance if you're just dehydrated by 3%.
Wow.
It's funny.
That's like
isn't
nothing.
it? Yeah, it's funny because we all think, oh, I drink water. It's like, well, okay. Now let's separate the two. We know that hydration, we can drink water, that's great. But then we're leaving out electrolytes. Now, when we go to the gym, we're not just sweating out water, we're sweating out zinc, selenium, potassium, sodium. We're not replacing these. So we need to be replacing these in order for our brain and body to function. So our wonderful brain, I've got a little brain model here for everybody, but the brain is made up of around 87 billion neurons.
Wow.
Not just that, 87 billion neurons, each having around 15 to 30,000 connections. Do the math now. That's huge.
Damn.
Okay, some of us are having 30,000 connections per neuron. Others are having maybe 15,000. And then as we move further close to neuronal death and neurodegeneration, we're having 0 connections. But you just think of it, right? The brain is also taking 25% of the body's energy intake. It needs so many things to function, not just the correct and adequate amounts of nutrition, but also hydration. Now, these connections, when they are made, it's made through this synapse. It's like a chemical signal, let's just call it. Now, so many things happen. When one neuron fires with another one, it creates a synapse. But during that moment, many things happen. We have this thing called a sodium-potassium pump. What's sodium and potassium?
Electrolytes.
Yes. And what did I say? When you go to the gym, you sweat out what?
Sodium and potassium.
There we go.
Other, yeah.
So exactly. So it makes sense to know that you will get a drop in cognitive performance when you're dehydrated. And most of us are going to the gym and maybe not sweating too much or maybe sweating a lot and just replacing it with water. And then we go to work. I know so many people that are, because I also work in the financial services space with hedge fund and portfolio managers. They may be going and getting their workout at around 1 p.m. and they'll come back and then they just get a slump in their performance. They're like, why? It's like, well, are you replacing your fluid intake with electrolytes? Oh, no, I'm not. It's like, okay, let's try that out.
Wow. I feel like most people probably wake up with about 2-3% dehydration.
Yeah, absolutely. When I wake up, I always have a glass of water.
Smart.
Yeah.
Do you do electrolytes in the morning?
No, I generally do electrolytes at around 11 a.m. because
11
I've done my training.
What is like the optimal morning routine to optimize brain function throughout the day?
Oh, I always say that you are preparing for sleep the moment that you wake up. So for me, for example, I wake up every morning at around 7 a.m. It's like clockwork, unless I go out the night before, which is very rare for me now. I'm a bit boring.
That's a good time. 7 a.m. is a good time.
Yeah, but I would say the best protocol would definitely be waking up and getting morning sunlight, not checking your phone. Now, in order for us to wake up, so we have to get a rise in our core body temperature. That's what essentially wakes us up. And then we get a surge of cortisol, and that shoots us up out of bed. So we've got that surge of cortisol. And the reason why I say to stay away from your phone is how many annoying things can you see in the morning that can just drive our cortisol up a bit more?
On social media, there's an endless barrage of things that can trigger most people.
Trigger, yes. Yeah. So that's why it's like you've got to be able to manage that. So just minimizing the amount of cortisol just by not checking your phone is a good thing. So waking up, getting at least 10 minutes a day of natural sunlight first thing in the morning. I always say exercise in the morning if you can, because it really prepares you for the day.
Yeah, it's hard to have a bad day if you've worked out in the morning.
Yeah, and I get questions a lot like, why shouldn't I work out at night? And I mean, there's no bad thing. It just really interrupts sleep patterns. But if you think about what exercise actually does for the brain, not just from a structural perspective, but from a cognitive perspective, like it motivates us. We get an increase in dopamine, serotonin, so many things. So it really sets the day.
Wow.
So perfect morning routine, in my opinion, is if you've already slept, you get up, you get your natural sunlight. You may do any type of breathing exercises if you want, and then exercise, and then maybe have your breakfast. And
are you a fan of a fasted workout?
Yes.
Yeah. Why? Why is that?
Well, I think there's apart from the science, well, as a woman, I'm now getting a lot of information around how to train around my menstrual cycle, and that involves eating before going to the gym and being able to lift. However, for me, born and raised as a triathlete, so we always trained at 6 a.m. So I never ate. So right now I never want to eat before I train.
Interesting.
Yeah. And so
that's just what you're used to.
That's what I'm used to. But also it's very hard for me to eat and then lift.
Yeah. I like both. I love doing a fasted workout, and then I also enjoy eating something light beforehand.
Yeah.
And I like to kind of experiment and see like what setting is going to like how I can modulate those variables, the variable of food for better performance in the gym.
Yeah. Are you having anything before you're going? Are you having any creatine?
I do creatine typically like an hour or two after I work out.
Why is that?
Well, because I think after a workout, your muscles are primed to uptake glucose, amino acids, things like that. And so there's some thinking that I think the evidence is equivocal on this, but I think there's some thinking that it's that you're particularly able to absorb and uptake creatine into muscle in the post-workout setting. Ultimately, I don't really think it matters that much as long as you're getting it consistently every day.
Yeah. And the reason I ask you is because I started experimenting, taking it before the gym. And for some reason, I have this rush of energy as if I've just taken a pre-workout.
With creatine?
Yeah, with creatine.
Interesting, because creatine's not typically thought of as having like an acute effect.
Yeah, I know. Maybe it's a placebo, which is great, but I took 5 milligrams, or 5 grams, I should say, and I went to the gym and I was just smashing it. And I'm like, well, this is great.
Love that.
So I'll keep it
Could have
going.
been a placebo.
Which is also great.
Yeah, also great. Why not?
Yeah.
Ride that wave, right? So, and then how do you typically, like what's your like ideal meal that you break the fast with?
So I don't subscribe to any diet. I'm Greek, so I was brought up with a lot of red meat. But I would say if I had to choose anything, I'm a mind diet girl. So I have a lot of fruits, vegetables, and I also have a lot of red meat. I like to break my fast with meat or with some type of protein. My biggest meal is I only have 2 meals a day. It'll be that one after my training, and then I'll eat dinner. And it's not a light dinner. Like I'll usually eat a lot of my carbs at night as well.
Well, you mentioned the mind diet. For people who are unfamiliar with the mind diet, what is that? Unpack that a bit.
Yeah. So, I mean, to the best of my knowledge, without going too in depth with it, it's basically a diet that was formulated for neurodegenerative disease such as Alzheimer's disease patients. So what they did was they took a cohort and they put them on the mind diet, and they realized that they could, I believe, slow or reverse Alzheimer's disease or slow the progression of mild cognitive impairment. So it consists of fruits, vegetables, whole foods.
Yeah.
And it also consists of meat.
Yeah, although
and fish.
Yeah, primarily I would say fish. I think it makes the recommendation for like lean meat, but it's not I don't know if it goes so far as to like recommend the consumption of meat. It definitely recommends fish.
It's huge on fish. So it's like a pescatarian diet, right? But it doesn't lean away from meat.
Yeah.
It is still involved in it.
Yeah.
So,
well, that's the thing about the way that the Mediterranean diet is sometimes described in the medical literature. It's almost as if it's like a meat-free diet, or it's like a low meat. But you're Greek, like
I'm Greek.
In the Mediterranean, like parts of the world,
Yeah.
they're eating meat, they're eating cold cuts, they're eating all kinds of things.
They're eating all kinds of things. Lamb, but especially red meat. So I don't know why. And a lot of olive oil, which we know is great. Actually, I recently heard you describe it as fresh olive juice.
Yeah, it's like olive juice, yeah.
Yeah, and if you go to Greece or if you go to Cyprus, which is where my family is from, you can go and get fresh olive oil that is made in these big drums. They literally, you go through, you see the olives being picked, they put them through, and you can put a glass underneath it.
No way.
It is like, it looks like grape juice because
it doesn't get any fresher than that.
Yeah, and you can just drink it that way, and it is literally like juice.
Whoa.
Yeah, so the stuff that we're getting, I don't know really what we're getting in the stores, but yeah.
What do you look for when you're buying olive oil? Because I mean, if anybody's gonna be a discerning olive oil consumer, it's you.
Yeah, extra virgin in a glass glass container. But I recently read a statistic that in all of the US, the best olive oil is actually produced here in California.
Interesting.
Yeah, so they've got amazing like olive farms that I think I'm going to start sourcing my olive oil out from. In Australia, I believe it's here as well. I get Crete's Best.
Crete's Best.
Yes,
that's a brand?
That's a brand.
Oh, interesting.
And Crete is a Greek island.
That's right.
Yeah.
So cool. Talk to me a little bit about more about nutrition and like the choices that you make and the choices that what you prescribe to your clients and patients and so forth.
So I try and stay away from nutrition. It is very controversial. It's not my field. We have a nutritionist on board. What I like to say is when it comes to the brain, and I've looked at, and I understand the studies are there to show the benefits of a plant-based diet, but I try and look at more so what are we feeding the brain. Now we know that the brain is primarily made of water and fat. We know that the type of fat that the brain is made up of is DHA. So I love feeding my athletes with high omega-3 fatty acids, EPA, DHA on a daily basis. I'm generally looking at 4 grams per day. Now, the literature, says that yes, it is good to feed an athlete that, especially, somebody who is under so much stress, because we know that EPA, DHA can have amazing effects on inflammatory biomarkers. It can really help downstream them. So, but there's also this growing body of evidence that says that unless a brain is growing, from an infant age, or unless it's under attack, such as mild cognitive impairment, maybe there isn't that much benefit. But these studies were not done on elite athletes, those who were training 8-9 hours a day. So I believe that EPA, DHA, when it comes to nutrition for the brain, is probably one of the best things that we can be having. So that's one thing that I'm definitely prescribing. Everything else comes down to what was your blood biomarkers and what type of diet are you currently on. We try and fix everything to try and get their biomarkers to a steady rate. When it comes to diet, I'm always of the opinion of the MIND diet.
Yeah, I mean,
or a
there's
ketogenic diet.
Ketogenic diet would probably be difficult to prescribe to an athlete though, right?
Yeah, but I mean, it's more so when you look at these athletes, and this is being really realistic, you've got to look at, instead of putting them on a diet, it's more so what can we take out of your diet that is not serving you well? That's the starting point, and that's hard. A lot of them don't want to listen. A lot of them, it's adherence. A lot of them say, well, I need the carbs, which is great. They can have the carbs. So,
well, what would you say are some of the more problematic foods that that people eat that could potentially be harming their cognitive function, their brain health?
Saturated fat.
Interesting.
So, let me explain why. So, your brain is the most vascular rich organ in the body. And for everybody listening, when I say the vascular system, I'm talking about the blood vessels, the veins, everything. If you pull apart all of the blood vessels in the brain, it can span 400 miles. That's how vascular rich it is. It is the most vascular rich organ. So therefore, we need to be feeding and talking about the vasculature of that. Now, when we hear about saturated fat, what do we think of?
Well, I immediately think of meat, but we just, talked about how it's a staple in the Mediterranean. We know that people who adhere to Mediterranean-like dietary patterns have reduced risk. So yeah. When
we talk about atherosclerosis, what do we think about?
Well, we think of vascular inflammation. We think about, clogged arteries and the like.
Yeah, and we always equate that to a heart attack. Okay, we always think of ASCVD, like a cardiovascular disease. We always think about, we don't want that. We don't want clogged arteries, right, because we don't want to get a heart attack. But we don't think about what it's doing to our brain. So we can have a heart attack, which obviously happens in one of the pumps on one of the arteries in the heart. But we can also have a brain attack, which is when one of the arteries, where we know it as a stroke or a cerebral infarct. When a stroke happens, it's one of the arteries that is clogged. But it's also the same. We can have a lung infarct. It's a pulmonary embolism. So all of these little strokes can happen just due to anywhere. So we need to be thinking about that as well. We have to think, okay, well, what is going to clog an artery or what is going to disrupt blood flow in one of these vessels. One of them is diet. One of them is, these little atheromas that are formed and then creates plaques.
Yeah.
But then there's also blood pressure. So blood pressure is the number one risk factor for a stroke or I'm going to call it an attack. And so if we're not managing our blood pressure, then what that's going to do is the tiniest little blood vessels in the brain, they are 1 cell thick. They will collapse. So if you have elevated blood pressure continuously, and sometimes we're not even going to check that. Some of us are only checking that once a year. That can attack one of the little vessels, and then that's gone. Then we have to move on to the next one. And then if you just mismanage your vasculature, you're going to end up with cognitive decline.
I think blood pressure is major.
Yeah.
And people should go, I think I have definitely I have one. I might even have two, but blood pressure cuffs, they're super cheap. You can get them on Amazon.
Yeah.
A lot of people experience white coat hypertension. They'll go to their doctor and get their blood pressure measured, right?
Yeah.
And they'll see an elevation in blood pressure, which isn't always reflective of where your blood pressure normally sits.
Yeah.
So I like to test my blood pressure every now and then just at home.
Yeah, and the best time to test it is first thing in the morning and then also at night. So one of the reasons why I'm really passionate about this is in 2019, my dad actually had a stroke. He had a temporal lobe stroke, and it's, just seeing the effects that it plays. And this was due to hypertension. And thankfully, he's still with us, but he does have a lot of, his cognitive performance has just gone backwards. His memory function isn't there, and I've seen what it does. And now he's also, he's obviously on a lot of medication to help with that, but we're getting him into the gym because we know how important exercise is. But it's something that is so easy. So just like mild cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's disease, we know that out of all of the patients right now, at least 3% of the population has the genes, the genetic risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. So we know that at least 95%, but I'm going to be safe now and say 90% of the people who currently have Alzheimer's disease, it can be preventable. It's just like a stroke. A stroke can be prevented if you do these things like check your blood pressure every day.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. I mean, whether it's like the Sprint Mind trial, there's so much data coming out, validating exactly what you just said, which is, I think, so crucially important. And there are so many ways that you can keep tabs on your blood pressure, from cutting out the sugary beverages and the like. But I want to go back to saturated fat just for a little bit.
You're going to come back to that
because it's interesting. Because I mean, the way that I've come to think about atherosclerosis is that it's multifactorial. I mean, saturated fat. If we're gonna demonize saturated fat, then we have to demonize meat. And meat, I think there's a lot of benefits. There was also that recent paper. It was I believe it was published in Nature Medicine, but found no association between red meat consumption and stroke.
But no, that's completely true. And when I say anything, I'm not talking just a little bit. You're talking about over-consuming saturated fats. Just like if you over-consume anything, evidently it's going to pour out of the cell. There's not going to be anything left in there. And where does it go? Yeah.
Well, where does it go?
It goes into the arteries.
Yeah.
And so if you don't have that clearance system, then what ends up happening? It ends up forming these atheromas, which ends up forming the plaque, and then that's eventually how we get the narrowing in that blood vessel. So, if I thought that saturated fat in a small amount was bad, then I probably wouldn't be eating red meat either.
Got it.
But it's more so about managing how much you're having every day.
So you're saying the dose makes the poison?
Yes.
Which is the case in so many areas of biology. But so then how do you recommend reaping the benefits of some of these nutrient-dense, albeit saturated fat-containing foods without putting yourself at higher risk?
But that's where you have to become your own physician. And what I mean by that is we're now at the mercy of ourselves. We have to learn how to educate ourselves. Now, we've got this podcast. We've got many different people that are available to us to tell us how much saturated fat we can have. That's the first step. The second step is measuring. I use MyFitnessPal. It's such an easy tool, and you can literally see how much saturated fat you're getting each day. And just don't go over the recommended amount. I mean, and then again, everybody's different. It's just like people say to me, Louisa, how many hours should I be sleeping a day? Everybody's different. So that's something that you have to talk to your, obviously, your physician about and figure out, what are my levels at right now?
Yeah.
And then figure out how much you should be having on a daily basis. So I'm sure you're not over consuming saturated fat.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm probably consuming, to be honest, more than what the guidelines would recommend, but I tend not to worry about saturated fat contained in whole, naturally raised food, like appropriately, responsibly raised food, I do think that there's an argument to be mindful of the saturated fat from industrially produced meat, because industrially produced meat is going to be higher in saturated fat, and it's going to be higher in specifically fatty acids that we know are able to raise various lipids in the body and things like that. But when a cow, for example, is grass-fed, grass-finished, it's got higher levels of stearic acid, which we know is neutral from a lipid standpoint. Ergo, it's harmless, even though it's technically a saturated fat. And I think that foods are, they're not, I've become, and what I've seen in the data is that it's like, it really is, it's not usually very productive to focus on single nutrients in isolation. Because people tend to eat whole foods, and it's like, there are different kinds of saturated, like this dark cocoa butter is primarily saturated fat, right? But it's primarily also stearic acid.
But just like what you just said, I like to focus on, I think what we're focusing too much on is what not to put in our body. And then we lose what we should be putting in our body, which is the macronutrients and the micronutrients.
Yeah.
And we tend to say, well, sugar's bad for me, I shouldn't have it. And this is bad for me, I shouldn't have it. But then we're not having the necessary micronutrients, and we're not getting what we need in our diet. And that's where it becomes scary, especially from an athlete's perspective, because they're trying to watch and monitor their weight depending on what sport they're. My Major League Baseball players are not trying to do that. But other boys are.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I definitely see an argument to be made for moderating and not going overboard with the saturated fat. So I completely agree with you there. I think that there's this tendency now with the different diet camps, right, that are almost like reactionary to the low-fat dogma of the past, that are now like, okay, well, fat's out of the doghouse, so let's just put butter on everything and ribeyes every night and things like that. And I don't think that makes any sense from an evolutionary standpoint, especially when you think about the animals that we most likely consumed. Historically, they were lean animals. Wild game is very lean compared to a modern domesticated feedlot cow, which is like an insanely fatty animal compared to what the kinds of meat that our ancestors ate. So I do agree that like overdoing the saturated fat, which becomes very easy in the modern industrialized food supply.
But then you have to also look at, we just spoke about the dose makes the poison, but also everyone has to know that you're dealing with different people. Okay. Yeah. So for example, if you take an athlete who has just undergone a major head trauma, the best known diet within the 24 to 48 hour timeframe is a high fat diet in terms of a ketogenic diet. And that's what, that's what a lot of the studies say, that post-traumatic insults, you should just fuel them with ketones, exogenous ketones, and maintain a high fat diet. So would that be right for somebody who hasn't had a head trauma? Maybe not. Everybody is very different. So you have to really assess that first. But keeping with the dose makes the poison is the best thing.
Yeah. And there's also there's added sugar, there's industrial additives,
that's what I'm more concerned about.
Yeah. There's like the grain and seed oils, the industrially refined, bleached, deodorized seed oils that we don't have long-term data on their impact on the brain. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of parts to this pie from a nutrition standpoint.
How do you feel about organ meats?
I don't think that people need to go out and
Yeah.
and like
And have a bull testicle.
yeah, start eating like raw balls and
Yeah.
like liver and things like that. But they are nutrient dense foods. I mean, if you think like liver, hello, it's like the top known source of choline,
Yeah.
which we know is very important to the brain.
Yeah, the only reason I said that is because I've recently just gotten on TikTok. The kids are telling me to do that, so I did, and I just for some reason I'm seeing now the testicle king.
Oh
and
God,
this and I
that's a thing.
There's a and he really eats these testicles, and one video was it's good for the brain, and so I clicked on it, and I thought, why is he spreading this on TikTok? Ugh. So that's
it's I mean, it's not just weird, it's disgusting.
Yeah, absolutely.
You're not gonna get me to eat raw balls.
No, me either. Raw.
I ain't doing that. Even if it were gonna make me more popular, not doing it.
Definitely not doing it. But why don't we talk about some of the things that are good for the brain and protecting the brain? And one of the biggest things that I speak about is exercise. And
Talk to me about that.
Yeah, I love it. I think we should be talking more about it. I think we should be going to the gym for our brain, for brain health, rather than just trying to get fit.
Gains,
yeah. So when we talk about exercise, I believe we've got 3 modalities. We've got resistance training, we've got aerobic, which are both absolutely crucial for the brain and the health of our brain and nervous system. Then we've got something over here, and I call it neuroathletics.
Ooh, what's that?
Well, that's my company. That's what I formulated back in 2016, but it really comes from cognitive function tests or cognitive training. So that's the brain games that we were talking about.
Love it.
Yeah, but it's called neuroathletics.
Neuroathletics.
Yeah. So it's getting the
website?
Yeah, definitely. But it's getting the brain being able to think and process information and do it under pressure. So let's talk about the differences in these 3 modalities of training and how they're beneficial for the brain. First and foremost, when we exercise, we get many different things. One of which is we get the release of growth factors. And this can come from aerobic training and resistance training. Now, aerobic training, aerobic training is really interesting. It's necessary and it's amazing. But when we first started doing studies on the relationship between exercise and brain function, we were doing aerobic training because we did it on rodents and we could only get them to run on a wheel, on a hamster wheel or on a mice wheel, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
And what they found was when they first did this study in 1999, the researchers found that, wow, exercise is amazing for the brain. We found that the hippocampus of these mice grew bigger. So the hippocampus is this little structure over here in the temporal lobes. We can pull this brain apart, but there's 2 hippocampi.
This is so cool.
Yeah, so if you pull it apart, you'll see where the hippocampus is. And
so if you guys are just listening to this, Louisa brought in this like beautiful brain demo. And you can check it out on YouTube, but it's so cool.
Yeah, one of it shows the vascular system, and then we've just got the structural.
These are the 400 miles of little blood vessels, right?
Yeah, aren't they beautiful? So there's both veins in there. So when the researchers were doing this, they found that the little structure in the brain called the hippocampus, which is primarily responsible for memory formation and consolidation, they grew new brain cells, new neurons in the hippocampus. And they thought, wow, this is unbelievable. And so that's where we got the notion of, okay, so exercise is good for the brain.
Incredible.
And, funnily enough, when it comes to Alzheimer's disease, that's one of the first parts to go.
The hippocampus.
Yeah. So that's step 1 to why we know that exercise is good for patients with Alzheimer's disease or mild cognitive impairment. What they also found was when these mice engaged in aerobic physical activity, they released these growth factors, also known as, one of them is known as BDNF. We've all heard about it. So the 90s and the early 2000s were all about BDNF, because that's what we thought was the magic pill. Now, this is a growth factor that can obviously help the proliferation of new neurons. But it wasn't until 2011 where there was this wonderful systematic review that was performed that showed the relationship between brain function and resistance training. And there was just so many wonderful things, and that's what caught my attention. We know that when we do resistance training, we're getting a whole array of different benefits. One of them is the release of these growth factors, but not just BDNF. There's actually now over 600 different myokines. Myokines are muscle-based proteins that are produced in the skeletal muscle. And once they contract, they shoot out of the skeletal muscle, they go into the bloodstream, and they have effects on our brain, both structurally and functionally. So
Wow.
yeah, over 600 different types of myokines that are released, that are not released doing anything else. So we know that when we are doing strength training, resistance training, it's got to be hard as well. And it's not just pick up a little tiny weight. We are releasing these beneficial growth factors, which go through and they lodge into different areas of the brain, and they have an effect on the brain. And I think that is beautiful. We have an effect on the gray matter. So if you are listening on, or if you are watching on YouTube, what I'm talking about here, over here, this is the cortex. This is the gray matter. We've got gray and white matter. And then the white matter is the myelinated neurons. And that's it. They are like highways. They are projections, and they connect, they connect to other neurons. And so we are having an effect on the gray matter structurally. So we can grow new gray matter through exercise alone.
Wow.
And we can also have an effect on the white matter. So that's the first thing. Now, from that, what else can we do? Well, back to vasculature. What happens when we work out? We get an increase in blood flow. Now, an increase in blood flow can then have an increase in blood flow to the brain. And when we do that, we are delivering both oxygen and nutrients to the brain through this increased blood flow. A really random fact about this, actually, when people retire, let's say they retire at 65, they stop using different areas of their brain because they're not at work anymore. I actually saw it with my parents. They stopped doing they weren't in front of a computer all day, so they stopped doing, and you can see shrinkage in different areas of the brain because there's less blood flow to these areas of the brain because they're not engaging in different things that your brain needs. Your brain needs variety.
Wow.
Yeah, so it needs to be doing everything.
This is blood flow reduced due to the fact that they weren't engaged in work, or because they weren't as physically active?
No, because they weren't engaged in that work. So if
Wow.
you stop using memory, for example, if you stop using, you look at this brain and, we've got the occipital lobe back here. There's every region of this brain is responsible for something different, whether we're thinking or whether we're throwing a ball or whatever it is, sensory information, whatever that is. If you stop using that area of the brain, it's not needed.
Use it or lose it.
It'll use it or lose it. That is the reason why you have to be, as you get older, longevity, you have to take this into consideration. The brain loves variety. It loves variety. So you have to be doing different things all the time for it to keep growing. So back to what I was saying, you work out, you get more blood flow to the brain, and that shoots out more oxygen. The brain loves oxygen. It needs oxygen to survive. It gets more nutrients. It gets it through blood. And so another wonderful thing is one of the best studies that was done on both resistance training and brain health was they showed that if you did more leg exercises and you built more muscle mass in the legs, that's better for your brain because that's where most of your muscle, that's where the bulk of your muscle is. So it also helps with glucose control and glucose sensitivity. But not just that, your veins are just a one-directional valve pump. So there's blood in there, but it just, what happens is when you work out in your legs, there's a lot of veins there. Your muscles, they push the veins. They squeeze the veins, and then the vein obviously goes up. The blood from the vein goes up into the vena cava, which then goes up into the brain. So you're doing so much from a vascular perspective for your brain. So working out both resistance training and aerobic training is fantastic for the brain. And then if you want to get even better and be even sharper or get the mental edge, try and do some cognitive training as well.
Super important. Don't skip leg day, guys.
Don't skip leg day.
I once read somewhere that when you train your calves, it's like you're basically you're building up like two auxiliary hearts down like in the lower hemisphere of your body, which is super important, especially down there because that's like the most distal part of your body from your heart, right?
Yeah.
So I've always been like, when traveling on long flights, I try to like work my calves, in the days leading up.
I just flew in from Australia. It's Monday today. I got here on Friday, and I was going.
It's a long flight.
It was 13 hours.
Damn.
I was going into the bathroom and doing squats.
Oh wow.
It's funny. I videotaped it, and I was like, this is what I'm doing. This is my life.
That's amazing.
On the plane doing squats. But I think we really need to, I think we underestimate what exercise does. I think we go to the gym to make ourselves look good when we have to know that, raising the heart rate it does amazing things for the brain. Even if, let's just say one of the best things you can do for a stroke patient is exercise because they're already lacking blood flow. Okay, they're already lacking oxygen. So how do we do that? We do that with more resistance training, and you're also building the arteries. They got little, you're building the cells within the arteries as well to make them stronger.
How intense does the aerobic component have to be?
You know what? I play with this all the time. I always say if you're getting to the point, okay, so you can go really extreme and use a heart rate monitor. But the way I generally like to say it is you shouldn't be able to finish a full sentence. So you want to be doing hard at minimum 20 minutes a day, 4 days a week. I always say that you want to do a mixture of zone 2. That's around 60 to 65% of your maximum heart rate. But for 15 minutes a week, and this can be broken up into 5-minute intervals, try and get that to the maximum heart rate.
Interesting.
As long as it's you're not going to pass out or die. And the reason being is VO2 max, there is a strong correlation between all-cause mortality and VO2 max. And I stress this to my parents as well. My father is 70, my mother is 67. And I stress to them as well, we need to still increase your cardiorespiratory system, the amount of oxygen that you can obviously withhold and sustain. And this is because we know that as you get older, that VO2 max decreases. And with all of the longevity studies, we know that there is a strong correlation between VO2 max and longevity. And that's also maybe because of oxygen. The brain needs oxygen. So, and the only way to really, increase that is by getting your heart rate to that point. And you can do so with 15 minutes a week of hard out effort.
15 minutes a week. So wait,
that's more of a maintenance phase.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, walk me through that because I've been 2 or 3 times a week. I've been jogging a mile, which is about. I mean, I do like a 10-minute mile. Like I'm not like killing myself, But that's pretty much it for my running. So it's like 10 minutes, maybe 2 or 3 times a week.
That's great.
So like a total of like 20 to 30 minutes.
Yeah.
But then I do a lot of walking, like brisk walking on the treadmill.
Yeah.
Where I can still hold a conversation. I'm definitely a little bit winded. I put the treadmill up to like a 5.5% grade. And then the speed is like, I'll usually start at like 3.4 and then I'll end up at like 3.6.
Yeah. And that's great.
So I'm like walking.
Yeah.
And I'll do that for like 20 to 30 minutes a day, or like 5 days a week.
Yeah. That's so you would say then you're generally in that zone 2 training?
Is that zone 2? Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. And I do that too because that's generally zone 2. The best way to really achieve the benefits of zone 2, which mainly is mitochondrial biogenesis. It's the creation of more mitochondria within the cell. We've got anywhere between 15,000 to 30,000 as well per cell.
Amazing.
Yeah. So if we can grow more, it's great, right?
Yeah.
It helps with energy production, helps with energy utilization. And we also know that centenarians, those who lived to 100 and above, had more mitochondria. Yeah. So that's great. That's why we should be training in zone 2. However, I believe that the minimal effective dose of that should be around 45 minutes.
Per session?
Per session, yes. Yeah. But there's no harm in what you're doing either. It's not like you're going backwards or reversing it.
Well, it's just interesting because you're from New York, you live in New York, right? I grew up in New York City. And whenever I'm in New York City, it's so effortless to walk everywhere.
Yeah.
You're 3 hours a day you're walking, right? In LA, you're walking like, if at all, a cumulative amount of probably 10, 20, 30 minutes a day or something like that.
Yeah.
And I just notice I feel so much better when I'm in New York and when I'm walking more. I feel so much better in every aspect of my being. And so I've been like spending a lot more time on the treadmill at the gym, just walking. And, but yeah, it's, I guess I got to get up to to 45 minutes. That's the
Yeah,
goal.
it's funny. I walk about 20 kilometers. I don't know what that is in miles. Every day in New York, because I'm walking everywhere.
It's so great.
Yeah, and I'm riding Manhattan, so it's actually easier for me to walk or take one of the city bikes than to get in a cab or on a train. But I did the when it wasn't raining yesterday and the day before. I did the hike, and I usually do it when I'm here, and I take, I guess, the easy route. And I forgot, and I just kept going straight, and I took the stairs. So on the right-hand side, you know, when you go up the stairs and it kind of feels like you're rock climbing.
Yeah.
And like I stopped. My heart rate got to 187.
That's pretty high, right?
That's pretty high for me. Yeah, that's pretty high. That's like
What is your max heart rate? It's 220 minus your age, right?
Well, that's if you haven't done a VO2 max test, then
Got it.
Yeah, that would be 220 minus your age for anybody listening at home. Have you done yours?
A test of VO2 max? No.
Yeah.
I think maybe I did at some point a long time ago, but I don't remember.
Well, you should, because I think it's a really great measure, because another thing that what you're doing is you're creating a base, okay? And that's like cognitive reserve, okay? You're creating a base, and to create that base, we have to do what we call cardiac remodeling. So that is when you're just building the cardiac muscles. You're building your heart to be able to pump out the blood necessary to keep you going, and you can build that in a zone 2 pace. So zone 2 training is fantastic, but you also have to do the strength training, and that. So if we want to get really specific with the strength training, you're generally looking at 70% of your 1 repetition max.
This is for strength training. 70% of your 1 repetition max. So how many reps would that equate to typically?
You could do 6. I generally say the guidelines.
So that's pretty heavy.
It's pretty heavy, yeah, because that's hard. I mean, just for everybody listening as well, 1 RM is if you are, let's just say if you're squatting, the maximum amount that you can do 1 rep with that squat. So then you get that, for argument's sake, let's say it's 100 kilos. You get that, so you do 70% of that. So you want to be lifting 70 kilos for your squat 6 to 8 times. But I generally see people really tapping out at around 6 reps.
And what is the point of that? Is that because we know now that like muscle hypertrophy occurs over a broad range of repetitions, right? Strength tends to be, you get the most gains lower on the rep range, but why? What's the benefit of focusing on this 70%?
Well, that's where the benefit comes of the myokines.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So when you look at these systematic reviews, you see that all of the benefits come from around this 70 to 75% of 1 RM. Is
it because there's evidence that we just don't get that same kind of myokine push at the lower end or the higher end of the rep range, or it's just that evidence doesn't exist?
Well, no, the evidence does exist, and
Wow.
it shows that, and these are high quality articles as well. I have to send you them. There's just so many right now, and actually this is for the next 2 years, this is what I'm researching, and it's solely myokines. Hopefully I'll be able to find a new one out of the 611 that are there.
Name it after, I guess you can't name it after yourself, right? You gotta have someone else to do it. Yeah, I would do that.
The Louisa.
Yeah, the Louisa.
Go and pump some weights to generate a Louisa. That's funny.
Well, okay, intensity is the key then, really, for yielding the greatest, I guess, concentration of these myokines that you're talking about.
I mean, look, if it was easy, we'd just be doing wall squats, right? And air squats. So you have to make it hard. And that's pretty much because when a muscle is contracting, if you're doing less, okay, if you're doing a lighter weight, you're not going to get the adequate amount of release. Okay, so one example is irisin, which is a myokine. You might get 30% instead of 80% release. So we want maximum release, and that would be doing it with a harder weight. So when you go to the gym, make sure you're lifting heavy. You're doing it at least 4 times a week as well.
I love that.
Yeah.
I'm trying to keep the dementia at bay for as long as possible. So
yes,
that's all great advice. What about sleep?
Yeah.
Sleep is important when it comes to the brain.
Sleep.
I reckon.
Yeah, I reckon too. Sleep is fundamentally the most underrated performance tool that we have. And it's at our disposal. We have it. It's free. And my God, sleep, just to have it as a general sewage system, washing out and clearing of our brain is just one of the benefits. So we know that we cycle through 4 stages of sleep each night. We go through, stage 1 is our light sleep. Stage 2 is still our light sleep. Stage 3 and 4 is generally where we're getting the most benefits from sleep. So stage 3 is our slow wave sleep, or also known as deep sleep, if you track it on a monitor. And then we've got REM sleep. And do you know why they call it REM?
I don't.
Rapid eye movement sleep. This is because when you go into and do a sleep study, polysomnography, what you see on the EEG, you see these horizontal eye movements, because that's what's happening during that. So when you go into a sleep study, you've got your eyes taped up, and you see these on the screen, it's got these horizontal eye movements. So your body is completely paralyzed, but your brain is still going a million miles an hour. So that's why they called it rapid eye movement sleep.
Wow.
Yeah. So
scientists are so creative.
Yeah, they're so creative. So the deep sleep is non-rapid eye movement sleep. And during this stage, two fundamental things happen. We get the secretion of a lot of hormones. One is testosterone for yourself. For women, it's estrogen, but we also get growth hormone. And this is responsible for protein synthesis and muscle repair, which is why I'm always telling my athletes we need to be monitoring deep sleep, and we do so. You know, whether they're wearing an Oura ring or a Whoop strap, we're monitoring it, and we're looking for a relationship. So we just want a steady curve. If they're normally getting 3 hours of deep sleep, then we just really want to stay within that time range. So deep sleep is extremely important, but then it's also important for the glymphatic system, and we've all heard of, most of us have heard of that. So back to our brain model. So right now we've got the brain, the structure of the brain. Then we have what lives on top of this is we've just got this little bit of fluid. Then we've got the skull. Now the fluid it's just water. It doesn't have anything in it to protect the brain. But what we've got inside the brain, we've got another type of fluid. It's called cerebral spinal fluid. And this circulates through the brain and then comes down through the spinal cord. And over the course of a 24-hour day and over the course of our life, we build up toxins. We build up toxic proteins, and some of them are our hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease. We know that amyloid and tau, these are hallmarks to Alzheimer's disease. These build up during the day just through stress or environmental toxins, and they get cleared out at night, and they get cleared out during deep sleep. And what tends to happen is we've got neurons, brain cells, then we've got these structural brain cells, okay, and they're called glial cells. Comes from the Greek word glue. They basically hold the other neurons together, and they shrink in size during deep sleep. And when they shrink, it allows the flow and passageway of the cerebral spinal fluid to go through and wash out the debris and the toxins that build up. So we want that. Okay, so just on amyloid and tau lives in the neurons. Okay, and amyloid lives outside of the neurons. So evidently, tau gets phosphorylated and then clamps together the microtubules, and then that's eventually what happens, that they scaffold, and that's how we get the neurodegeneration inside of the cells. But then on the outside, what happens is, imagine these little structural neurons. You've got neurons and you've got the glial cells, and then there's tau there as well. And tau is not, you've got amyloid, and amyloid is not bad, but if we don't clear it out when we need to, then that's eventually what forms neurodegeneration. So we need to be sleeping. We need to be getting into deep sleep. What we also need to be doing is we need to be doing as much as we can to optimize for deep sleep. So like I said at the start, we are optimizing for sleep the moment we wake up. So if you're doing things such as drinking alcohol, we know that alcohol or ethanol is a sedative. It's going to completely block REM sleep, and it's going to sedate us. So it's not going to even allow us to get into these deep and REM sleep stages. So we need to stop drinking alcohol.
A lot of people drink alcohol because they think that it helps them get to bed faster.
Yeah.
But it degrades sleep quality.
Yeah. So the active ingredient in alcohol, which is ethanol, which is the thing that has the psychoactive effect, this is a sedative. You know, when you go into surgery, you get pumped full of propofol, which is a sedative. It knocks you out. It sedates you. It's pretty much a low level what alcohol is doing. So you're not sleeping. It's just sedating you.
Wow.
Yeah. It's also lowering your inhibitions. So that's something that we need to stay away from. I'm actually huge on this. So people keep asking me, come on, one drink. It's like there is no benefit to alcohol whatsoever. And I don't know, I'm not going to go into resveratrol and the whole resveratrol myth, because in order to get the amount of resveratrol from one glass of wine, you can't do it. You need about 100 glasses of wine.
Yeah.
So alcohol's bad. Stay away from it.
Do you drink ever?
I will drink red wine. Okay. I drink it with my father, maybe one glass, but I'm not a drinker.
Yeah.
Even as a triathlete, we would test it. I was never allowed to drink. So during my 20s, I was not a drinker.
Yeah.
And in my teens.
Same. I rarely drink, but I'm not dogmatic even in my own assertions and my own stance on alcohol. Like I occasionally will enjoy like a nice glass of wine.
Yeah.
I'm not deluding myself into thinking that it's good for me or that it's not bad for me.
Yeah.
But the dose makes the poison, I think, at the end of the day.
It does. Even the studies show that if you're having 7 glasses a week, which is equivalent to 1 a day.
Right. That's moderate.
That's moderate. And you can have some brain damage from that. But we won't get into that. But that is something that can definitely block these sleep stages.
Any way to mitigate the damage, like of drinking? I'm not recommending anybody drink. Like if you don't drink, don't drink. That's great. But like, is there anything that can be done to like mitigate the damage?
I've heard that N-acetylcysteine is good for mitigating. I don't know why, but I'm going to have to learn that because I'm getting asked a lot about alcohol. It's as if people just want to know that it's good for you.
It probably supports like liver glutathione production because it's cysteine. Yeah,
it's the precursor to glutathione. So so that's something that is going to not help you with deep sleep. But then there's also light exposure. Then the number one reason for insomnia and waking up during the night and not getting into deep sleep is stress. So it's the activation of that sympathetic nervous system. So we have to manage stress and anxiety. And then also temperature. Temperature is a huge one. I sleep on a temperature-controlled mattress because my entire apartment in New York is set up like a lab. It's pretty crazy, but I monitor my temperature throughout the night. Wow. In order to fall asleep and stay asleep, our core body temperature needs to drop at least 2 degrees. So we need to be making sure that we are getting into that temperature zone to have a good sleep.
What do you use?
I use an 8 Sleep.
8 Sleep, nice.
Yeah.
I just got one of those.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
And how is it?
I love it. I was using now we're sponsored by 8 Sleep, but I decided to take them on as a sponsor because they sent me the product first and I tried it and I really liked it because, well, for multiple reasons. One, I'm a hot sleeper. So my bedroom, the air conditioning in my bedroom, it just doesn't get cold enough for me, like the way that my house is set up.
And that's ambient temperature.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a different thing.
Right. So I was having like major issues with like, waking up sweaty and things like that. So I was using one of their competitors for a while and it was a game changer. And then the temperature aspect of the 8 Sleep is just as great. It's incredible. It like has fixed my problem. Like I don't sleep hot anymore. But the thing that I love in particular about the 8 Sleep is that it also, without having to wear a wearable, it also tracks your sleep.
Yeah, that's the thing. You wake up and you get your sleep score.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love that. I also love the feature on the app where it gives you breathing exercises before you go to sleep.
Oh, cool. Yeah. I haven't explored those yet.
Yeah, they're kind of like gamifying the whole system. And that's fun. If we need to gamify anything in our life, I say go for it. If it's going to get you to sleep better. So, and people may be saying, but Louisa, I don't have a sleep controlled mattress. Maybe start with, putting the air conditioning down, or sleeping with your feet out of the sheets. Maybe that'll help as well. But we know that temperature is a big one for sleep. And then there is REM sleep. We love REM sleep. REM sleep serves, and I say this to my athletes, it's emotional first aid. And a lot of them, if they have if they're on the court and they haven't slept, I know that they're going to have a short fuse. I know that they're going to, if something doesn't go their way, they're going to scream and it's going to be at the detriment because the media is on them. So I'm like, just please do as much as you can. Like, please sleep. And you're generally looking at a 2-to-1 ratio from deep to REM sleep.
2-to-1 deep to REM sleep. Interesting.
Yeah. And so you should be focusing on at least 20% of total sleep time to be in REM sleep.
20% total sleep. So how do you micromanage? Or is it just about getting the appropriate duration of sleep? Yeah,
it's about getting the very first starting point for anybody who's having sleep trouble is just try and extend your total sleep time. If you look at your stats, and I always say, look, because I wear, I monitor everything. sometimes you could be in bed for 9 hours, but you're only sleeping for 7. So you have to just increase that. You have to get an increase in total sleep time. That's the first thing. There's no point in working with someone and optimizing if you're getting 6 hours of sleep. That's just stupid. So just get that length first, and then we can figure out what's wrong. If you're getting 10% of REM, why? We have to figure that out. REM can be mitigated through even medications. A lot of SSRIs can kick you out of REM sleep as well.
Wow.
Yeah, so light, what we're eating, stress, all of these things can kick us out of REM and deep sleep.
You mentioned THC as being one of these like things you want to avoid. Weed, right?
Yeah. It's just not good for you.
It's not good for you.
No, and it's also having the same effects of alcohol. Maybe it's sedating you, but I'm more concerned when it comes to marijuana. I'm more concerned about long-term usage. We know that it just leads to bad things in the brain. CBD is very different. We know in the marijuana plant, we've got this THC, which is this psychoactive portion of the plant, but then we've got CBD, and we know that CBD can be somewhat beneficial, especially when it comes to synaptogenesis, which is the synapses and the creation of the connections.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I don't delve into that too deeply. I know that there's a lot of people saying, well, the first studies that were done were on epilepsy patients and CBD. And that is true, but you and I right now are not having a seizure. So we can't just say that, oh, but if it's good for seizure patients and then that's why it's good for me. We can't say that because we're not having a seizure right now.
Right.
Yeah. So.
Well, but it's interesting. We had Christopher Palmer on the show recently, who's a psychiatrist who's done a lot of writing on the ketogenic diet and its application for other forms of mental illness other than epilepsy.
Oh.
And his logic is that, we have all this good data on the drugs that are used for epilepsy. And as a psychiatrist, he will often prescribe these drugs for other forms of mental illness, and they work, right? So he kind of...
As in like Keppra.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I don't know much about the pharmacology of these drugs or the names or anything like that. But he connected the dots and he was like, well, if the ketogenic diet is so effective for these, treatment-resistant forms of epilepsy, maybe they'll be useful as well for bipolar, schizophrenia, and things like that, schizoaffective disorder, all these other conditions. And he's seen in his clinic like incredible success using this diet as a therapeutic tool. And so I don't know, maybe it stands to reason that things that, other things that might be beneficial in the setting of these, rare, neurological conditions might be effective elsewhere. We just have to be open-minded, I guess.
Yeah, we have to be open-minded. And look, that's the same as I remember I was interviewing a psychiatrist as well who was working on major depression, people who have got major depression. And he was getting them off an SSRI and putting them into a sauna for like 7 days straight, really, large amounts of sauna sessions. And what he found was that the effects of these heat shock proteins mimicked SSRIs. So he was able to lower the dosage or even get them off completely, the SSRIs, and it improved their depressive-like symptoms.
Wow.
Yeah, so I understand, So obviously practice everything with caution.
Practice everything with caution, but yeah, I mean, like diet and lifestyle interventions should always be the first line. Let
me tell you, when you really, and you've dug into the research, and you've provided a phenomenal platform to show people that you can starve off neurodegenerative diseases and diseases of the brain like stroke through lifestyle interventions. They are sleep, exercise, and nutrition. These three things are things that were gifted to us by Mother Nature, can really starve off these diseases unless you are part of that 3% or 5% that has the genetic mutations that are susceptible to getting these diseases, like the Huntington's gene, the chromosome 4. Like you, if you do have that on chromosome 4, then you will get. We know that. Okay, if you do have the ApoE4 2 and 2, you have a likely chance of getting it. Still doesn't mean that you're going to get it. There are places where, is it Africa? I don't know where it is. You'd probably be able to say where people do have the ApoE4. They're a 4 and 4, and they still don't get Alzheimer's disease. Why?
Yeah, or the likelihood is just a lot lower.
Yeah, but why?
Yeah, because it's epigenetics.
It's
right?
epigenetics.
Environment. It's the dance between your genetic predispositions and the environment in which you find yourself.
Yeah, and the thing that I'm struggling with, and I hope I find my answers, is which one is best? Is it nutrition? Is it sleep? Is it exercise? Because we know that a combination of all three is the best. But which one is it? And I still veer towards exercise, and that is because even in the late stages of Alzheimer's disease, or even with Alzheimer's disease, I think the best thing to do is exercise.
Yeah.
If you had to choose one.
Yeah, I think that I would probably agree with you, because you can eat the healthiest possible diet, but if you're sedentary, then that's going to wreak havoc on your body. You could eat the worst possible diet, at least for a time, while you're young, right? I mean, we're not talking about ideals, but you could eat the worst possible diet. But as long as you're exercising with regularity, consistency, and your strength training, and you're doing aerobic training, you will build up a degree of resilience against that diet.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, that exercise will go a long way.
Yeah. And back to the cognitive reserve. Cognitive reserve, you've got to think about it as if at 90, I'm going to war, so I'm going to need the fuel in my back. And that's what cognitive reserve is. So it's going to really help you in the moments that you do need it. It's like when we really need to have the right amount of fats for NFL players, for example, to mitigate the effects of a concussion. So because they're obviously going to get concussed.
So crazy.
It's crazy. And look, soccer is my favorite sport. Do you call it football?
Soccer.
Soccer. So that is my favorite sport to watch. But I'm also against headbutting at a young age.
Right.
Yeah. You said so yourself offline that you've held a brain, and we know that the brain is like this hard gelatinous structure. So it's soft. Yeah. It's hard but soft. So what happens is when you're getting a child who is headbutting and their brain hasn't fully developed,
oh God,
it is just, like I said earlier, you've got this fluid that separates the skull with the brain, but it's not protective at all. It's like water.
No, yeah.
So the brain, when it gets hit, it's just going
just sloshing against
right?
Yeah.
And it's like, that's this poor little thing. Like it's getting traumatized. And we need to be careful of that too.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I remember just growing up, like as a kid, being an idiot, being a boy, you find yourself in all kinds of situations where your head's getting hit.
Yeah. I can't say I went through the same thing.
Oh, man. You grew up in Greece?
No, I grew up in Australia. My parents were born and raised in Cyprus. I go there I go there almost every year.
Amazing. Yeah. So cool. Well, there's so much here. Like you left us with such incredible information. Is there anything else? Anything else you want to touch on?
One thing, and I've never said this on a podcast, but I've been thinking about it a lot. I think another thing we need to add to longevity and health of the brain is happiness. We don't speak about that because there's obviously, it's not scientific, but I think there's a lot to play. And I haven't researched it too much, but I think that there is a lot to say about connections. And we know that even with Alzheimer's disease, one of the things that they start to withdraw away from people and start to become really, by themselves. And that's a scary thought. And as we get older, the brain needs connection. It needs love. It needs happiness. So being able to form relationships throughout the lifespan is also going to help with the growth of your brain.
Super important. Loneliness is a toxin.
That's a good one.
Yeah. Well, we had this guy, Robert Waldinger. He's a psychiatrist from, I think he's up at Harvard. I forget, but he was just on the podcast, and we had a great conversation all about. He's at the helm of this 80-year-long study where they looked at all these people over time to see what are the key variables that determine successful aging and lack of disability in old age and the like, and happiness and so on and so forth. And he found that the one thing that mattered the most was strong social bonds.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah. There you go. That may be something else that we'll talk about in the future.
Do you feel like you have that?
Yes. I feel like as I'm getting older, I am actually getting smarter with the bonds that I have. In my early 20s, it's like everyone's my friend. But now I'm getting really structured and smart with who I spend my time with, who I bond with, who I have relationships with, and I make them matter rather than just going out just for fun and just.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You got to do the work with relationships. You got to water them. You got to consider them like plants, essentially, that require water.
And work and effort.
And yeah, all that stuff. But it's so true. I feel very lucky as well. I have like my brothers, I have my friends. I've got my loyal, wonderful followers that listen to the show, and I feel connected to them.
And you've got a cat.
And I've got a cat, Delilah, who's like running around, terrorizing the place. So yeah, lots of connection. Hey, if you like that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.
Then they'll understand what's going on in their brains. And that is 3/4 of the battle. That is just, if you know what's going on with your brain, if you read Anna Lemke's book and you see what's going to happen, you can see two weeks from now, I'm going to feel a lot better. In a month, I'm going to be this thing is going to be kind of behind me. In a year from now, I can't fall back into this. You'll be like, okay, I can do that.